Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into a world where being round, soft, and visibly well-fed wasn't just socially acceptable. It was literally the goal. We're talking about Victorian England, a time when the ideal body looked like it had never once skipped a meal, never missed a dinner party, and had probably been sitting in a velvet chair since Tuesday. The kind of body that walked into a room and announced without saying a single word, "I have money, I have food, and I have absolutely no reason to run anywhere." So before you get comfortable, and I really do want you to get comfortable for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what I put out here. It means more than you know. And a truly massive, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. Knowing that you're out there throwing ideas into the comments is honestly what keeps this channel alive, and I mean every word of that. Now dim those lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft white noise in the background. Pull your blanket up, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because I need you to think about something for just a second. Have you ever looked at a Victorian portrait? One of those heavy oil paintings where everyone looks slightly offended, deeply uncomfortable, and suspiciously warm, and thought, why does everyone in this painting look like they just finished an entire roast pig and then sat down immediately? Did Victorian doctors actually believe that being fat was a sign of good health? Did thin people get quietly turned away at dinner parties? Was being able to see your own cheekbones considered some kind of medical emergency? Did wealthy women genuinely try to gain weight the way we try to lose it today? With special diets, supplements, and desperate late-night prayers? Could you actually be too thin to get married? Too lean to be taken seriously? And what on earth were people eating to get that way? And why did anyone think it was a good idea? Congratulations. You have just woken up in Victorian England. The year is somewhere around the 1860s. Your corset is already laced. Your table is already set. And your doctor has just informed you with great clinical authority that your cheeks simply are not full enough and you must eat more beef. Welcome. It only gets more fascinating from here. Let's begin at the very beginning. And in Victorian England, the very beginning is always food. Not for pleasure, not for fitness, but for power. In a society completely obsessed with class, wealth, and the desperate need to look like you possessed both at all times, your body was your most visible financial statement. A thin frame didn't whisper disciplined or athletic the way it might today in a gym, selfie, or a wellness influencer's Instagram feed. No, in Victorian England, a thin frame whispered poor, it whispered hungry, it whispered, this person probably works with their hands. To be visibly plump, soft, comfortably rounded, that was to announce to every room you ever entered that you had more than enough to eat, and then some, that your pantry was so reliably stocked, so consistently full, that the idea of skipping a meal had simply never crossed your mind. Think about what that actually means for a second. You wake up in 1860-something, you pull on your layers, you look in the mirror, and the question staring back at you isn't, do I look slim? The question is, do I look like someone who has never once had to wonder where their next meal is coming from? Because that is the signal the room is waiting to receive. That is the social credential. Everyone is evaluating the moment you walk through the door. Wealth in the Victorian era wasn't always easy to demonstrate visibly. You couldn't flash a smartphone. You couldn't casually reference your investment portfolio in polite conversation. What you could do was walk into a room, looking robustly, undeniably, unmistakably fed. The body was the portfolio, and everyone in the room was doing the math in real time. This wasn't accidental or coincidental. It was the direct, logical outcome of a society in which food insecurity wasn't some distant, abstract concept. It was the next street over. It was the family that had slipped from comfortable to struggling after one bad year. A dead business partner, a husband who drank too much and earned too little. The precariousness of Victorian economic life was real. It was visible, and the people most desperately trying to signal their distance from it were precisely the ones in the middle. The clerks, the merchants, the aspiring professionals, the families clinging to respectability, with both hands on the rope. For those people, a plump wife and round-cheeked children weren't vanity. They were proof that the household was functioning, proof that the bills were being paid, proof that the pantry door, when opened, revealed actual food, rather than a humiliating expanse of empty shelf. The upper classes, who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, took this even further. Grand Victorian portraits of aristocratic families show figures of magnificent solidity, not obese, precisely, but present, occupying their chairs with authority, spilling slightly over their waistbands, with the calm, untroubled confidence of people who have genuinely never once considered what waistbands are actually designed to prevent. Queen Victoria herself, in her later decades, was described in terms that today would generate concerned headlines and Twitter threads, but in her own time prompted respectful, approving nods. She looked, people said, like a woman who was doing very well, and they meant it as a compliment. They meant it as a character assessment. Now add to all of this the Victorian understanding of what poverty actually looked like up close, and the picture sharpens considerably. The poor were thin, not as a lifestyle choice, not as a fitness preference or a wellness philosophy, but as an inescapable consequence of not having enough. The workhouse, the slum, the struggling widow, all of them wore their circumstances on their bodies in a way that any Victorian passerby could read instantly and accurately. Thinness meant want. Thinness meant struggle. Thinness meant the absolute bottom of something, and nobody with any choice in the matter wanted to be associated with the bottom of anything. So the next time someone looks at a Victorian portrait and says the subject is a bit heavy, just remember, that person was broadcasting competence. They were performing financial stability for an audience that knew exactly how to read it. They weren't heavy, they were successful. And in Victorian England, the difference between those two things was the distance between one bad harvest and the end of everything you'd spent your life building. Pass the roast. Let's talk about Victorian medicine, which operated on a set of principles that would make any modern physician place their forehead very gently through a wall. In an era before germ theory was widely accepted, before vitamins had been identified, before anyone had figured out that bleeding a patient was almost certainly not a cure for anything, doctors held some genuinely spectacular opinions about weight and health. Thinness, to the Victorian medical establishment, was not neutral. It was not merely an aesthetic preference or a natural body type. It was a symptom, a warning sign, a red flag flapping energetically in the wind of your clearly deteriorating constitution. Thin patients were viewed with real, genuine clinical concern, not necessarily because they were starving, but because their bodies were failing to demonstrate the visible, padded abundance that a properly functioning human being was supposed to carry around at all times. The consultation itself was quite an experience. You sat across from a physician whose confidence was, to put it generously, not calibrated to the limits of his actual knowledge. He looked at you. He assessed your color, your posture, your general outline. He might press thoughtfully on your abdomen with the focused expression of a man who truly believed the abdomen had useful opinions worth hearing. He asked about your appetite, your digestion, your bowels, always the bowels, and your sleeping patterns. And if, at the end of this careful examination, you presented as insufficiently substantial, he delivered his verdict with the gravity of someone delivering life-changing news, which in his own mind he absolutely was. You were too thin. You needed to eat more. He was going to write recommendations. He expected to see improvement. Those recommendations were not complicated. More animal protein, regular meals without exception, cream, wherever cream could reasonably be introduced, into sauces, into puddings, into morning porridge if you could manage it, red meat, preferably beef, because beef was considered the most fortifying of all available options, the thing most likely to build the muscle, tissue, and visible solidity that separated the healthy from the concerning. Rest was also prescribed because exertion was believed to burn away the very substance you were trying to accumulate, which sounds suspicious until you remember that these were also the people who thought fresh night air could give you a fever. The theoretical framework underneath all of this was the miasma model, the idea that disease traveled through bad air, that the body was a vessel whose defenses were partly physical and visible, and that a well-padded body was simply better defended. Fat was not inert in the Victorian medical imagination. It was insulation. It was reserve. It was the body's stored evidence that it had been given what it needed and had the wherewithal to hold on to it. A thin body, by this logic, was a body running on empty, exposed, depleted, vulnerable to whatever the urban air decided to deliver that day. And given the actual state of Victorian urban air, that was quite a lot. What makes this particularly fascinating is that the Victorian physician was not entirely wrong. In a world before reliable food supplies, before central heating, before antibiotics, having physical reserves genuinely mattered. Thin people did die faster when illness arrived. They did have less to lose. The underlying observation was real. The theoretical framework was simply constructed from the wrong materials with extraordinary confidence. In a room with no windows, your modern doctor has access to a century and a half of additional information, randomized controlled trials, peer-reviewed research, an understanding of cardiovascular risk that would have made a Victorian physician blink slowly and ask for a fortifying drink. But the Victorian physician had beef tea, good intentions, and an absolute certainty that the thin patient needed to go home and eat considerably more. 2 out of 3, in certain circumstances, isn't the worst track record. You cannot fully understand why nobody wanted to be skinny in Victorian England without first understanding what Victorians actually ate, and the morning meal alone is enough to make a modern nutritionist quietly lie down on the floor and stare at the ceiling. Breakfast in a prosperous Victorian household was not a piece of toast grabbed on the way out the door. It was not a smoothie. It was not something you consumed while answering emails with your other hand. It was an event, a formal, seated, multi-course commitment to the idea that the day had not truly begun till you had done serious damage to at least 3 types of protein: kippers, kidneys, cold cuts from last night's roast, deviled bones, which sounds alarming and tasted exactly as aggressive as it sounds, eggs in several configurations, porridge for the more moderate among you. Though moderation at a Victorian breakfast table was considered mildly suspicious behavior, the sideboard was the centerpiece of the Victorian breakfast room, and it operated as a permanent buffet of serious intent. Silver chafing dishes kept things warm. Covered platters stood in a row with the quiet authority of items that expected to be taken seriously. You moved along that sideboard in the morning the way you might move through a museum, slowly, thoughtfully, with the understanding that each item deserved your full attention. Now, let's talk about the kippers for a moment, because they deserve it. A kipper is a whole herring, split open and cold smoked, and it has a smell that announces itself approximately 3 rooms in advance. To eat a kipper for breakfast is to commit to your morning in a way that leaves absolutely no ambiguity. It lingers, it follows you into your first appointment of the day, and stays for the second. The Victorians loved them. They ate them with the calm satisfaction of people who found nothing even slightly strange about beginning a workday with a smoked fish and a side of kidneys, which were, incidentally, often cooked in a sauce so aggressively rich that it essentially constituted its own second breakfast. The function of all this abundance, the kippers, the kidneys, the deviled bones, the eggs prepared 4 different ways, was not merely sustenance. It was fuel for a body expected to go a very long time before its next formal meal. Victorian luncheon was more of a light midday refreshment than a full meal, at least in households where dinner in the evening was still understood to be the main event. So breakfast needed to carry you. It needed to load you up so thoroughly that by 3 in the afternoon, you were merely hungry rather than actually faint in public, which was considered genuinely embarrassing. Children in Victorian households were expected to eat with enthusiasm. Nursery breakfast happened earlier, and separately, a practical arrangement that spared the adults the theatrical spectacle of trying to eat deviled kidneys while managing a small person who had decided that porridge was objectionable. But the children, they ate their porridge with the knowledge that the adults downstairs were doing something considerably more interesting with their morning, and that the smell drifting up through the house was proof. The whole magnificent, calorically ambitious production of the Victorian breakfast was at its core an act of faith. Faith that the day ahead required serious preparation. Faith that a body properly loaded in the morning was a body capable of conducting business, managing households, educating children, and arriving at dinner 8 hours later with an appetite still fully intact. The Victorians were right about the preparation. They were perhaps slightly over-enthusiastic about the kidneys. Here is something that would genuinely rattle around in your head if you were a thin woman navigating Victorian society. Thinness was not just unfashionable, it was socially catastrophic. In an era where a woman's primary social goal, at least according to the grinding social machinery surrounding her on all sides, was to secure a suitable marriage, your body was part of the negotiation, and a thin body, in the eyes of Victorian men, their mothers, and the culture at large, sent a deeply troubling set of signals. It suggested fragility. It suggested an inability to survive childbirth, which was still a genuinely terrifying reality. It hinted at poverty, at poor nutrition, or worse, at illness. Consumption, the great Victorian killer, wore thinness as its most recognizable calling card. So a visibly thin woman at a dinner party was not simply slender. She was, in the collective social imagination of every person in that room, possibly dying. The marriage market and Victorian society was admirably direct about calling it exactly that, a market with all the transactional clarity the word implies. Assessed women on a range of criteria, and physical presentation ranked extremely high, not beauty necessarily in the way we might define it today. The Victorians had considerably more practical concerns. Childbearing capacity was the fundamental question, and the body was expected to provide visible evidence of a reassuring answer. A full figure, good color, round arms, a face that clearly suggested reliable, consistent nutrition. These were the physical markers of a woman likely to survive what marriage in the Victorian era routinely demanded of women. A thin, pale, angular woman required explanation. She required reassurance. She required, usually, a considerably larger dowry to offset the anxiety she was quietly generating across the room. Mothers understood this completely. Victorian mothers with marriageable daughters knew, with the practical clarity of women who had navigated the same system themselves, that their daughters needed to look healthy, which meant unambiguously, undeniably, looking fed. The anxious feeding of daughters approaching marriageable age was a real and recognized social phenomenon. Cream in the puddings. Second helpings firmly insisted upon early bedtimes to encourage the kind of rest that was believed to convert food into visible flesh rather than burning it off in the midnight hours when young women had absolutely no business being awake, worrying about anything anyway. The production of a suitably rounded daughter for the marriage market was, in its own quiet way, a project with deadlines. And it wasn't only about marriage, though marriage was the most urgent pressure point. Thinness in women carried a specific moral weight that it didn't quite carry for men. A thin woman implied either that her household wasn't feeding her properly, a management failure, or that she herself was refusing to eat properly, which implied vanity or nerves or some kind of modern nonsense that respectable women simply did not engage in. The appetite was supposed to be healthy and unashamed. An appetite well maintained and regularly satisfied was evidence of good character, sound nerves, and domestic contentment. Appearing to refuse food, or appearing to have done so, suggested that something was very wrong, in ways that every person in the room would spend the rest of the evening quietly speculating about in low voices just beyond earshot. The genuinely cruel irony in all of this, of course, is that the very corseting Victorian fashion created digestive conditions that could make enthusiastic eating genuinely uncomfortable. A waist compressed to fashionable dimensions does not accommodate a full Victorian breakfast with the ease you might hope. The body was being asked to perform entirely contradictory requirements simultaneously, to be visibly full and round, above and below the waist, while being dramatically narrowed in the middle, and it was expected to manage all of this without complaint, without inconvenience, and certainly without becoming thin in the process. Women who were naturally slender, or thin through illness, or stress, or simple constitution, lived under a persistent social cloud that no amount of sparkling personality could entirely dispel. If you want to truly understand what Victorian society valued, skip the philosophy books and go directly to the dinner party. That is where all the real information lived. The Victorian dinner party was not, at its core, about food. It was about architecture. It was a carefully constructed performance of wealth, taste, social standing, and the implicit suggestion that you had done this sort of thing so many times that you were barely even impressed by your own table anymore. Multiple courses arrived in a sequence so elaborate it had its own formal name: service à la Russe, the Russian style, where dish after dish emerged from the kitchen in dignified procession, each one an opportunity to demonstrate both the quality of your cook and the apparent bottomlessness of your appetite. To eat sparingly at a Victorian dinner party was not dainty. It was rude. It was suspicious. It suggested something was wrong with you, with your digestion, or most alarmingly, with your finances. Preparations began not that afternoon, but days in advance. The menu had to be planned, provisions ordered, the cook consulted, and the cook's opinion carefully weighed before being subtly overridden. The table had to be dressed, and Victorian table dressing was not a casual undertaking. Starched linen, silver polished to a mirror finish, crystal that caught candlelight and threw small constellations across the ceiling, floral arrangements of impractical magnificence. The entire effect was designed to produce, in every arriving guest, a mild, carefully calibrated sense of inadequacy about their own domestic arrangements. You were supposed to look at this table and feel that your hosts had access to a dimension of existence you were still earnestly working toward. Then came the courses, soup first, always, without exception, because soup was how you signaled this was a real dinner and not some improvised light supper. Then fish, then the remove, a grand roast or composed centerpiece dish, then entree, smaller, more delicate dishes, demonstrating the cook's range and imagination, then the game course, if the season and your connections were right, then sweets, jellies, creams, ices, tarts, puddings in their architecturally ambitious forms, then the dessert course of fruit and nuts, and finally, the dignified passage of port around the table, while the women retreated to the drawing room and the men sat with their unfiltered opinions and their very good wine. 7 courses, sometimes 8, in ambitious households, more. Each course accompanied by the appropriate wine, poured by servants, trained to be invisible in the particular way that only people being paid to be invisible can truly achieve. The whole enterprise lasted 2 hours at minimum. 3 was not unusual. 4, in houses where the conversation was especially good, or the port especially freely flowing, was a mark of genuine distinction. And through all of it, you ate. You ate everything placed before you, or everything that could reasonably be consumed, without causing genuine physical distress, because to repeatedly leave your plate untouched was to insult the cook, trouble your host, and generate precisely the kind of concerned attention you absolutely did not want at someone else's table. The beautiful, inescapable logic of the Victorian dinner party was this: the more enthusiastically you ate, the more you demonstrated that you were exactly the kind of person who deserved to be at this table. The appetite was the credential, and in Victorian England, you kept your credentials impeccably current. Before slimming teas, before calorie counts appeared on restaurant menus, before and after photos dominated every social media feed, the Victorian self-improvement industry was running at full speed in the exact opposite direction. Weight gain products, weight gain diets, weight gain advice columns, these were as common in the Victorian press as weight loss content is in ours today. Newspapers and ladies' magazines ran advertisements for tonics, powders, and carefully designed meal plans promising to add inches to your frame and restore color to your cheeks. Physicians published pamphlets, chemists stocked special preparations. The anxiety wasn't, how do I get thinner? The anxiety was, how do I get properly substantial before someone notices I'm not? The whole enterprise ran on the exact same cocktail of insecurity, aspiration, and dubious science that drives every wellness industry in every era, just aimed in a direction that would make our current cultural moment absolutely spin. The advertisements were magnificent. They spoke the language of medical authority and social aspiration simultaneously, which is the timeless formula for selling people things they're worried about needing. Holloway's pills for the thin and the pale. Clark's world-famed blood mixture restores the ruddy glow of health. Patent medicines of every description promise to accomplish what beef and cream had so far failed to do, to transform the unfortunate thin person into the kind of person who looked like they belonged in a well-appointed drawing room, rather than a cautionary illustration in a medical textbook. The ingredients in most of these preparations were not closely examined. The critical thing was that they existed, that they came in a bottle with a label, and that the label used the word constitution at least twice. The dietary advice was more grounded, though grounded in Victorian nutritional understanding is a phrase that requires some qualification. Eat frequently, never skip a meal, add fat wherever fat could reasonably be introduced. Butter was a prescription item in this context. On the bread, in the vegetables, stirred into the sauces, applied generously to anything that would hold still long enough. Cream appeared in its full fat, completely unapologetic Victorian form. In puddings, in coffee, in soups already richly stocked, with several other things. The philosophy was elegantly simple. If more calories went in, more substance would eventually appear on the outside, which is directionally correct. If aggressively implemented, rest was always part of the prescription because the Victorian medical imagination was deeply suspicious of activity, viewing it as something that consumed rather than built. The thin person, who was also energetic, was making a nutritional error in real time, burning off the very reserves they were supposed to be accumulating. Rest after meals was not laziness, it was strategy. The prescribed life of someone trying to gain weight in Victorian England looked remarkably comfortable from the outside. Regular meals, afternoon rest, early bedtime, no unnecessary exertion. It was essentially a luxury spa retreat, justified by medical necessity. Certain patients must have found the diagnosis extremely convenient. Women's magazines of the 1870s and 80s ran reader correspondence, columns where thin women wrote in describing their difficulties, and received advice from editors who apparently felt entirely qualified to address them. Miss T.W.W. of Birmingham was advised to take a glass of milk before bed and avoid excessive walking. A concerned subscriber was told that daily cream soups and reduced mental agitation would likely produce visible results within 6 weeks. The Victorian weight gain industry was, at its heart, the same thing all wellness industries have always been: a commercial response to anxiety. People were worried about being too thin. Industries formed to address that worry. The products mostly didn't work as advertised. The advice was variable in quality, and the underlying anxiety persisted regardless. The specific direction of the anxiety is the only thing that has changed. The structure is eternal. Here is where Victorian body ideals become genuinely confusing, and navigating it requires holding two entirely contradictory thoughts simultaneously, which is actually very Victorian of you. On one hand, the corset was squeezing the waist into dimensions that defied comfortable breathing. On the other hand, the hips, the bosom, the upper arms, the cheeks, all of that was expected to be full, generously rounded, and thoroughly present. The ideal Victorian silhouette was not thin, it was shaped. An hourglass of considerable volume, nipped dramatically in the middle, then blooming outward above and below in both directions. The goal was not smallness, the goal was specific architecture. You could have a 17-inch waist and still be considered worryingly thin if your face looked gaunt or your arms lacked reassuring substance. The corset manufactured the waist. Everything else was supposed to get there the natural way, through beef, cream, and sheer dedication. The corset itself was a remarkable piece of engineering. Originally whalebone, later steel, ran in vertical channels through a stiffened garment that, once laced, redistributed the soft tissue of the torso in directions it had not naturally considered. This was not a gentle process. Victorian women, who had worn corsets since childhood, developed musculature and rib arrangements that reflected years of structural intervention. Women who began corseting in adulthood had a considerably more complicated relationship with the process, involving weeks of gradual tightening and a fundamental recalibration of what normal breathing felt like. That was, by most accounts, character forming. But the corset was not trying to make you smaller. It was trying to make you shaped. The bust was supposed to swell visibly above the corset's upper edge. The hips were supposed to curve out generously below. The padding built into Victorian dresses, the carefully constructed architecture of petticoats, bustles, and hip padding that shifted in silhouette every decade or so was designed to add volume precisely where volume was considered correct and necessary. The bustle of the 1870s and 80s added an architectural extension at the back of the skirt that required considerable confidence to carry off and a certain spatial awareness when navigating Victorian furniture. It was not subtle. It was not designed to be subtle. It was designed to make you appear to occupy significant space, because significant space meant substance, and substance meant health, and health meant everything in a society that was reading bodies constantly and drawing conclusions accordingly. The deeper contradiction at the heart of the entire corset era is this: Victorian fashion was officially trying to improve on nature. The corset corrected the waist, the padding corrected the hips, the whole engineered silhouette was the ideal body made achievable through construction, but the face and arms remained stubbornly, inconveniently natural, and on a thin woman, they told the truth regardless of what the dress was doing below the neckline. You could construct the ideal Victorian shape onto almost any woman with sufficient structural support, but you couldn't pad a face. You couldn't corset a forearm into looking substantial. Those elements were yours. They were still broadcasting their information to the room, and in a culture that read bodies as relentlessly as the Victorians did, gaunt cheeks above a carefully engineered gown were a contradiction everyone noticed, and no one was quite polite. enough to mention directly. To understand why plumpness carried such enormous cultural weight in Victorian England, you have to understand what illness actually looked like in that era. And in the Victorian period, illness looked extremely, visibly thin. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, was one of the great killers of the entire 19th century. It consumed you, slowly and publicly, stripping weight from your frame and color from your face in a long, very visible decline. By the time a Victorian person was recognizably consumptive, they looked fragile, pale, hollowed out, and romantic in exactly the tragic way that absolutely nobody wanted to be romantic. Cholera moved faster, but left the same skeletal aftermath. Fevers burned through fat. Poverty ground people thin over years. Thinness in the Victorian medical and social imagination was almost always associated with something fundamentally wrong. With disease, with deprivation, with a body quietly losing a fight it should have been winning. To be visibly fat was to be visibly and demonstrably not dying, which was, in the most literal possible sense, the entire point. Consumption was everywhere in the Victorian world. In the novels, in the newspapers, in the bedrooms of real families, where someone was coughing in the night, and everyone was trying very hard not to notice how much weight they'd lost since autumn. It cut across class lines with democratic cruelty. The wealthy died of it in comfortable rooms, attended by physicians who could do very little. The poor died of it in conditions that accelerated every stage of the disease. Artists and poets died of it dramatically, and the Romantics before the Victorians had made this seem almost glamorous. Pale, passionate, intense, burning away in a meaningful way. The Victorians, who were considerably more practical, found this framing profoundly unhelpful. They did not want to look consumptive. They wanted to look the absolute opposite of consumptive. Healthy, substantial, present, and firmly, unapologetically of this world. The social anxiety around visible weight loss was therefore not irrational hypochondria. It was a calibrated response to a genuine and omnipresent threat. When a Victorian person said that someone was looking pulled, or thin in the face, or not quite themselves, they were often making a specific, worried medical assessment rather than a vague social observation. They were running an internal checklist. Is there a cough? Is the color right? Has the appetite changed? Because the checklist had a purpose. The early stages of tuberculosis were the stages when intervention might still accomplish something. Take the patient somewhere with better air, feed them more aggressively, rest them absolutely, and hope the disease had not yet established itself too firmly. Catching the thinness early meant catching the danger early. And in that context, the Victorian obsession with maintaining visible weight wasn't vanity. It was a very reasonable survival strategy. Dressed up in dinner clothes, children in prosperous Victorian households were fed with a dedication that bordered on athletic. The plump child was the healthy child, the thriving child, the child that reflected well on its mother and reassured the entire extended family that the next generation was coming along properly. Thinness in a child was treated as a genuine emergency, something to be corrected through regular, aggressive feeding, supplementary meals, and the kind of concerned hovering that only Victorian mothers could sustain indefinitely. Servants were instructed, schedules were enforced, puddings were mandatory. The idea of a child voluntarily refusing food was met not with patience, but with genuine alarm, because in an era where infant mortality was a constant shadow over every household, a child who wasn't eating was a child whose future was suddenly uncertain. The nursery operated on a schedule because the Victorians believed in schedules, the way some people believe in religion, with deep conviction, absolute consistency, and a certain controlled violence toward anything that dared interrupt them. Breakfast at a fixed time, the midday meal at a fixed time, nursery tea with bread and butter, and something sweet if the week had gone well. at a fixed time, bedtime following a small, warm supper designed to keep a child's interior furnace running through the night without burning out entirely before morning. The nursemaid or governess was enlisted as frontline officer in this daily campaign. Her job, among many other things, was to ensure that the children in her care ate what was placed in front of them. Victorian children's literature is full of enthusiastically eating children, round, rosy, perpetually rewarded with more food, which tells you something significant about what the culture was valorizing and what adults were expected to actively encourage in the young. Puddings deserve their own dedicated moment because in the Victorian nursery, pudding was not a treat. It was a medical delivery system. Nursery puddings were designed to be dense, caloric, warming, and strategically persuasive to a small person who might have resisted the main course, but was generally willing to negotiate on something sweet. Bread pudding, rice pudding, sweat pudding, which involved actual kidney fat and produced something approximately the texture of profound contentment. Jam roly-poly, these were not confections. They were architecture. They sat in the stomach with quiet authority and informed the body that whatever was happening next, it would happen with adequate fuel. Visiting relations inspected, children with the focused attention of people who considered it their absolute right and solemn duty to have opinions about the physical development of anyone they happened to be related to. Grandmothers were particularly acute. They pinched cheeks. They commented on arms. They deployed the word puny in a manner clearly intended as diagnostic rather than cruel. Though the small recipient of the assessment might have disagreed vigorously, a grandmother who declared a child a good size was dispensing the highest available nursery praise, and every mother in the room understood it as a comment on her household management just as much as on the child's genetics. In Victorian England, your diet was a public document. What you ate, how much, how it was prepared, where it came from, who served it to you. All of it was legible social information that anyone in the room could read instantly and with considerable accuracy. The working poor ate bread, potatoes, cheap cuts, gruel, and whatever could be stretched furthest by someone cooking over a small fire with very little to work with. The middle classes worked extremely hard to eat like the upper classes and lived in constant low-level terror of slipping back toward bread and potatoes. The upper classes ate things that required an entire household staff to produce and a week's wages to purchase. The difference showed up in bodies, in the visible padding of the well-fed versus the leanness of the struggling. And everyone in Victorian society knew precisely how to read it. The Victorian food system was, in certain respects, extraordinarily transparent. The things that required money to produce, white bread rather than coarse, fresh meat rather than scraps, sugar, imported spices, cream, were distinguishable at a glance and a taste from what poverty produced. You couldn't fake a good joint of beef. You couldn't counterfeit fresh butter or pass off thin gruel as substantial broth with any long-term credibility. The food told the truth about your circumstances, even when everything else was being carefully managed to tell a different story. This is precisely why the Victorian middle classes, aspiring, anxious, relentlessly striving, spent such enormous nervous energy on the quality of their table. A household that ate well, served proper meals at proper intervals, prepared by a cook who approximately knew what she was doing, was a household making a social argument every single time it sat down to dinner. The argument was, "We belong here. We are not the bread and gruel household. We are the household with a decent roast on Sunday and a pudding on Wednesdays, and a cook who, however variable her temperament, produces food that would not embarrass us if a guest arrived unexpectedly." The adulteration of food was a Victorian scandal of impressive proportions. Once it became publicly known through the work of investigators like Friedrich Acum and later journalist John Postgate, it generated a level of public outrage that eventually produced the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860. Before that legislation, and to a diminished extent after it, food available to the poor was routinely stretched, diluted, substituted, and contaminated. Bread that looked like bread was partly chalk. Milk that looked like milk had been significantly extended with water. Tea that appeared to be tea might contain a substantial proportion of already used leaves, dried and sold again. The consequences fell hardest on the poor, who couldn't afford to shop elsewhere. The thin bodies of Victorian working-class communities weren't simply the result of poverty, they were also the result of the food that poverty could purchase being systematically stripped of its nutritional value before it even arrived. Charles Booth's surveys of London poverty in the 1880s and 90s and Seabohm Rowntree's parallel investigation of York in 1901 produced detailed accounts of working-class diet that made sobering reading then and still do now. Families living below the poverty line existed on diets providing insufficient calories for the physical labor they were required to perform daily. Children in these families showed the effects in their growth, their energy, and the specific leanness that results not from appetite suppression or personal choice, but from the simplest arithmetic. The calories required exceeded the calories available, and the body resolved the deficit the only way it knew how. The gap between those children and the round-cheeked, well-puddinged children of the Victorian middle class was not a gap of genetics or willpower or personal management. It was a gap of bread, chalk, and mathematics. When a Victorian patient presented as alarmingly thin, the treatment was not a psychological evaluation. It was not a specialist referral. It was beef tea, and it was prescribed with the confident authority of someone who had absolutely no doubts about their methods whatsoever. Beef tea, essentially a strong, concentrated broth made from slowly simmered beef, was the Victorian remedy for almost everything, but thinness especially. It was easy to absorb, nutritionally dense by the standards of the day, and could be consumed by patients too weak or too disinterested to manage solid food. Physicians handed out recipes, households kept standing pots of it simmering, invalids received it on trays. The logic was impeccable by Victorian standards. You need more substance in your body. Beef contains substance. Therefore, drink beef until you are no longer concerning. It was the 19th century's protein shake, just considerably less flavored, and served with considerably more medical gravity. Isabella Beeton, whose book of householding management was essentially the Victorian Bible of domestic competence, devoted significant attention to the preparation of beef tea and similar restorative preparations. She approached the subject with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything else, because in her world, and in the world of the Victorian household generally, feeding the sick was a serious domestic responsibility. A woman who could not produce reliable beef tea was a woman with gaps in her preparedness, and gaps in preparedness were the kind of thing that surfaced at the worst possible moments when someone actually needed the beef tea and there was nothing available but cold mutton and embarrassment. Beyond beef tea, the Victorian physician's arsenal for thinness included calves' foot jelly, produced by boiling calves' feet into a rich, gelatinous liquid that set when cooled, considered highly restorative, and delivered to invalids with the understanding that they were receiving something both nourishing and expensive, which doubled its perceived effectiveness. Cod liver oil appeared regularly in prescriptions for thin children and was administered with the cheerful determination of adults who had decided that the child's opinion of cod liver oil was medically irrelevant. The remarkable thing, viewed from this distance, is that it sometimes worked, not because of any specific therapeutic magic in the beef tea itself, but because rest, warmth, regular nourishment, and the focused attention of a functioning household are genuinely restorative conditions. The Victorian physician prescribed them from an entirely wrong theoretical framework. but occasionally with the right practical instinct. The patient improved. The physician took credit. The beef pot was replenished. The system continued, satisfied with itself, until the next thin person appeared in the consulting room. If you were fortunate enough to be invited for a weekend or a fortnight, because Victorian house parties did not believe in brevity, at a well-appointed English country house in the latter half of the 19th century, what you were actually being invited to do was eat continuously at regular intervals until Sunday evening arrived, and it was time to go home. Breakfast was a monument, then elevenses. Lunch was a meal of genuine ambition. Afternoon tea was not a small affair. It involved sandwiches, cakes, scones, and a determination to hold you over until dinner that suggested whoever planned it had very little confidence in your self-restraint. Dinner was the main event, then supper. In between, people walked, rode horses, shot things, and played lawn games, partly for pleasure, and partly, you strongly suspect, to justify the next meal. The Victorian country house operated on the philosophical principle that a guest who wasn't eating was a guest who wasn't comfortable, and discomfort in a country house was the only real social failure. The shooting lunch was a specific Victorian institution that combined outdoor activity with indoor appetite in a ratio the outdoor activity cheerfully struggled to justify. A shooting party that had spent the morning walking through cold fields in pursuit of pheasants reconvened at midday in a lodge or farmhouse and ate a lunch of heroic proportions: cold game pies, hot soup from tureens that had traveled in insulated boxes on carts, bread in quantity, cheese of serious character, more wine than the afternoon shooting perhaps recommended. But nobody was driving anywhere, and the pheasants could manage their own risk assessment. Afternoon tea arrived in the drawing room between 4 and 5, and it came on a scale that the word tea does not remotely prepare you for. Sandwiches with the crusts removed, scones with clotted cream and jam in a quantity per scone ratio. That was a matter of fierce regional conviction. Small cakes, large cakes, something involving sponge and cream that had been made that morning and would not survive until tomorrow, which was the only pressure the entire afternoon tea exerted on anyone present. You went home at the end of the weekend slightly heavier than you arrived, and this was considered the correct outcome. You had been looked after properly, the house had done its job, and you were visibly in fine condition for having been there. The bathroom scale as we know it, that small, quietly judgmental object that lives on your floor and tells you things you weren't entirely sure you wanted to know, did not exist in the Victorian home. Weighing yourself was not a daily ritual of self-surveillance. It was, if it happened at all, a medical event conducted in a physician's office with equipment that looked appropriately serious. And what the physician was looking for when he weighed his patients was not whether they had gone up. He was checking whether they had gone down. Weight loss was the clinical red flag. A patient who arrived lighter than at the previous visit needed immediate attention, investigation, and dietary intervention. Perhaps another course of beef tea, prescribed with fresh urgency. The ideal result of a Victorian weigh-in was that the number had held, or better yet, had moved in the correct direction. The physician's scale in Victorian England was an instrument of reassurance, not reduction. It was oriented toward the precise opposite of everything our relationship with scales has become. What is striking about the Victorian relationship with bodily measurement is how fundamentally inverted the frame of reference was from our own. We live in a world that has decided with considerable force and considerable commercial reinforcement that the direction to monitor is upward, that the threat is weight gain, that the goal is reduction, that the scale exists to catch you moving in the wrong direction before it goes too far. The Victorian physician's scale was oriented in the exact opposite direction. The threat was loss. The goal was maintenance or increase. The scale was there to catch you drifting toward thinness before it became the kind of thinness requiring more serious intervention. To stand on a Victorian physician's scale and be told you had lost weight was not a quiet compliment delivered in clinical language. It was a warning. It was the beginning of a medical conversation that would end with dietary prescriptions, lifestyle adjustments, and possibly a recommendation to spend time at the seaside for the restorative air, all of which sounds extremely pleasant until you remember that the entire reason for all of it was that your body was moving towards something the Victorian world considered genuinely dangerous. The scale was the instrument that made the invisible visible. What it was looking for, and what it feared finding, was the number going down. The relief when the number held or rose was the relief of someone who had been checked for something serious and received genuinely good news. You were not wasting, you were maintaining, you were doing exactly what a Victorian body was supposed to do. The Victorian vocabulary around weight is wonderfully revealing, not just in what it says, but in what it deliberately avoids saying. The word fat was considered rather blunt, slightly rude, reserved for animals and people you didn't particularly like. The preferred language was altogether more celebratory, well-fed, comfortable, in fine condition, nicely rounded, handsomely proportioned. These phrases appear constantly in Victorian novels, medical records, and letters between mothers discussing their children. They treat a well-padded body as an achievement, a correctly executed outcome, evidence of excellent management. A woman described in a Victorian novel as comfortable in figure was not being mocked. She was being paid a quiet, genuine compliment. She had done the thing correctly. Meanwhile, thin characters in Victorian fiction tend to be villains, consumptives, misers, or people in the grip of something eating them from the inside. The vocabulary doesn't lie. Victorian novels deploy physical description as character shorthand with a consistency that initially surprises the modern reader, and then, once the underlying logic becomes clear, becomes entirely predictable. The good housekeeper is stout, the prosperous farmer is ruddy and round, the kindly aunt has arms described as comfortable, and a laugh that shakes her agreeably. These are not neutral observations. They are reassurances, signals to the reader that the person described is safe, established, and firmly on the right side of the social ledger. Dickens was particularly accomplished at this. His benevolent characters are reliably well-fed. His misers and villains are wiry, lean, pinched. The physical expression of people who are withholding from themselves and from everyone else. The vocabulary of Victorian fiction about bodies is the vocabulary of Victorian society itself, deployed with a novelist's conscious, deliberate intention. Letters between Victorian women discussing mutual acquaintances show the evaluative vocabulary operating in real time. She's looking very well, meaning she has gained weight reassuringly. He seems rather pulled, meaning he has lost weight, and there is possibly something concerning going on. The children are wonderfully thriving, meaning round, rosy, and apparently impervious to the usual childhood hazards. The coded quality of this language was not really a code at all. Everyone understood precisely what was meant, because everyone was operating from the same reference system. The body was legible. The vocabulary that described it was designed to capture that legibility with appropriate social tact. And so, here we are, at the end of a very long, very well-fed day in Victorian England. You have spent your waking hours navigating a world where your body was your biography, a public document written in beef and cream and Sunday pudding, readable by everyone who passed you on the street or sat across from you at a dinner party. You have been assessed by physicians who wanted you rounder, dressed by ladies' maids who needed more material to work with, and fed by a domestic establishment whose entire purpose was to ensure that the people inside it emerged from each season looking like people who had never once had cause for concern. You have eaten kippers at breakfast, navigated the sideboard at the country house, survived the 7-course dinner, and taken your prescribed glass of port before bed. You have, in short, done everything Victorian England asked of you, and Victorian England asked quite a lot. What stays with you when you set down the last empty dish and let the fire burn low is not the excess of it, not the mountains of food, the magnificent confidence of the physicians, the social machinery grinding away behind every dinner invitation. What stays with you is the human need underneath all of it, the need to take care of people, the need to signal, in whatever language a culture makes available, that the people you love are safe, that the world outside is cold and precarious and full of things that can take someone from you without warning. But inside this house, at this table, with this fire burning, everyone is fed, everyone is here, everyone is, for this moment at least, all right. The Victorians got a great deal wrong. Their science was approximate, their social hierarchies were brutal. The gap between the dinner table of the prosperous and the bread and chalk reality of the poor was a distance that should have been intolerable and largely wasn't. But through all of it, through the beef tea and the corsets and the magnificent self-assurance of a culture certain it understood what a healthy body looked like, there was something genuine, a commitment to nourishment as an act of care, an understanding that feeding someone is one of the most fundamental things one human being can do for another, a belief, however imperfectly expressed across 7 courses and a prescribed port, that the body mattered and deserved to be tended. So tonight, as you settle into your bed, your warm, comfortable, thoroughly modern bed, with its actual mattress and its actual pillow and its complete absence of livestock, take a moment to appreciate what you have, that the Victorians were working so hard to build toward, the reliable warmth, the food in your kitchen that will still be there tomorrow, the medicine that actually works, the scale in your bathroom that you use voluntarily, in private, without a physician present and without dread. And if somewhere between now and sleep, you find yourself thinking about a good meal, something warm and substantial, eaten in the company of people you genuinely like, know that you are thinking one of the most deeply human thoughts available to you. The Victorians would have understood it completely. They would have nodded with satisfaction. They would have probably suggested you add cream. Sleep well, everyone.